I'll turn it over to Brian Stafford. Brian's a lieutenant colonel in the Kentucky National Guard. He is the plans and operations officer for what we refer to as DOMS, or the Directorate of Military Support. DOMS is the supporting Kentucky National Guard agency that supports emergency management here in Kentucky. So, Brian, welcome and thank you for being here. I'm going to turn it over to you to go ahead and let everybody know what you can do for us.
All right, thank you all very much. As Mr. Kovach mentioned, my name is Brian Stafford. I'm a full-time civilian employee for the Kentucky National Guard and our Directorate of Military Support. I'm also a member of the Guard, where I'm a lieutenant colonel in our unit out of Richmond. Also with me today, I have First Lieutenant Douglas and Specialist Snyder from our cyber team. Later on in the presentation, I'll give them some time to talk about what we're doing as far as plans, and we're building structures to support state and local government for cyber response. So today I'll be going over some of the historic missions the Kentucky National Guard has performed, what our structure is, how we build what we would call combat power to provide support to communities, some of the authorities and limitations we operate under, the planning and outreach that we conduct across the state, and how your communities can request both emergency and day-to-day support from the Kentucky National Guard for things like parades and festivals. And then I'll bring up our cyber team to talk about their capabilities and plans, and then we'll open it to questions. If at any time you have questions, I don't know if the screen I'm looking at will have the raise hand function, but I'll rely on Mr. Kovach to speak up and let me know to address a question. So as far as our historic response, I came to the Directorate of Military Response in 2020, and our first major missions were supporting the state's COVID response. So we operated and managed testing and vaccination sites, provided administrative and labor support to hospitals and nursing homes. We had a team that did data entry for the State Department of Health because the amount of data pouring in didn't allow their normal full-time structure to deal with the volume that was coming in. We spent a lot of time in food pantries just because of the context of people being away from work. There was a huge demand for that, and we were able to provide soldiers there for, gosh, probably close to 2 years. We also constructed and managed shelters. Some of the pictures you see there, our air wing in Louisville turned one of the wings at the Fair and Exposition Center into an overflow ward because at the time, pretty much every hospital, their ICU was at maximum capacity. We only had to make minimal use of that overflow facility, but we had those beds ready if they were needed. The next mission that we supported was the civil disturbance response in Louisville in 2020. So we were direct support to law enforcement, both Kentucky State Police and Louisville Metro Police. Our mission that we prefer to do as opposed to patrol is doing critical site and infrastructure security. In our mind, if there is an incident and the courthouse or government infrastructure needs to be protected, our preferred role is to come in and secure those areas and free up civilian law enforcement to do actual patrol and law enforcement duties. So instead of having 5 or 10 officers tied up at the courthouse, we can provide, 10 or 12 guardsmen, and maybe you only have to have 1 or 2 civilian law enforcement officers tied up on that infrastructure. And also for the civil disturbance mission, as well as a lot of our law enforcement missions, we provide traffic control. So in December of 2021, we responded to the Western Kentucky tornado. The pictures you see there are the candle factory, before and after satellite views. So we sent collapsed structure search and extraction teams into the candle factory and other structures in the area. We also provided a fatality search and recovery team. Sadly enough, we've had to use those guys a couple times. That element is actually currently deployed to North Carolina supporting Hurricane Helene response out of state. We did a wide area search for survivors. So we have an element in the National Guard that's trained on standard FEMA structure search and rescue patterns. So they can easily partner with any civilian SAR elements that come in to support your county. And it's pretty seamless. Those guys are trained to a high standard and they use the FEMA standards, so there's no loss of information. We report searched areas and things like that in the same format. Again, traffic control, we did some law enforcement augmentation. For those of you that aren't tracking post-tornado and post-floods, there were out-of-state looters on the ground within 36 hours. So having a uniform presence to augment county and local law enforcement was pretty important at that time. And we also did commodity distribution to food shelters, or to food banks and shelters. That was a long-term mission for us. We provided staffing to points of distribution for, I think, 6 to 9 months after the tornado. The next event the Kentucky National Guard responded to was the floods in eastern Kentucky in July of '22. We provided aerial, ground, and water rescue. Again, wide area search in the affected areas for survivors and unfortunately also for fatalities. And again, provided traffic control and law enforcement augmentation and commodity distribution to communities and helped operate shelters. Outside of emergency responses, the Kentucky National Guard supports both large and small festivals and observances. Annually, we support Riverfest, Kentucky Derby, and Thunder over Louisville. We go into lots of communities, provide color guards for parades, help with traffic control for county and city festivals, and do static display, both touch-a-trucks for children. We participate in the Keeneland Concours d'Elegance every year with military vehicles. And we do, I would guess, around 120 fairs and festivals every year. And later on in the presentation, I'll talk about how you can access that capability if you so choose. All right, so next I'd like to talk about the structure of the Kentucky National Guard. So we have approximately 6,500 service members. Around 5,800 of those are Army, 700 are in the Air National Guard. At any given time, we have 45 to 50 active armories, with 4 to 6 being unoccupied and being refurbished or repurposed. We have larger facilities in Louisville, Frankfort, and Central City. In Louisville, we have the 123rd Air Wing Air Base co-located with the Muhammad Ali International Airport. In Frankfort, we have Boone National Guard Center. That's the state headquarters. That's where my office is. The Director of Military Support is co-located with the State Emergency Operations Center. That allows us to immediately sync with them during emergency responses. And having visited other states that don't have that structure, being physically located with State Emergency Operations Center is a huge benefit to the Commonwealth of Kentucky. In Central City, we have the Wendell H. Ford Regional Training Site, where we have firing ranges, training areas, barracks, meeting space. So later on, I'll talk briefly about our New Madrid seismic response plans, but our Western Kentucky training site will be our primary staging area to get resources into Western Kentucky in the event of a New Madrid event. We also have small training facilities with really minimal infrastructure in Knox and Powell counties. And the Kentucky National Guard is what we call a dual mission force. So we have a federal mission as a military organization. Every unit in the Kentucky National Guard has a task to support federal active duty forces during times of war. So I've spent most of my career in artillery units. I've deployed overseas twice in support of active duty missions. And that's the mission that the National Guard is funded by the federal government to train for and that we're equipped for. I'll talk a little bit later about how we translate our combat structure into domestic response capabilities. We also have an obligation to be the state response force for state missions. And some of the friction we experience is trying to balance the equipment we're assigned and the missions we're assigned with the needs to prepare for state response. So the federal government funds the National Guard. Every unit, drills 2 days a month, goes to a 2-week annual training in the summer, and that funding is for training for our federal combat mission. Any training we do for state responses, we have to kind of work in as we're able, since the federal government doesn't provide money for that purpose. We do have state active duty, which the governor and the adjutant general can authorize to use for training. But we get into time demands as well. If I know I've got to spend 2 days a month, 2 weeks during the summer for everybody in the National Guard to train on their combat mission, how much time are they willing to give from their civilian employment and their families to do training for state missions? Here's a map of our facilities with a breakdown of where our major facilities are, where our brigade level headquarters are. So you can see we've got pretty good distribution across the state. I'll talk a little bit later about how some of our capabilities are concentrated in certain areas, like we get a lot of demand for engineers, construction equipment to help clear roadways and things like that, especially after winter ice storms. Those capabilities are really concentrated in Eastern Kentucky, headquartered out of Ashland, and Western Kentucky, headquartered out of Owensboro. So if we have a demand for engineer equipment, we have to bring it in from those areas where it's concentrated at. So units in the Kentucky National Guard, we have some patches there. Emblematic of those units, we have the 63rd Theater Aviation Brigade. That's where all of our helicopters, they have a limited logistics capability to haul stuff and fuel. They're headquartered out of Frankfort. The 38th Division Artillery is a headquarters element that coordinates field artillery support to larger combat formations. They're currently headquartered out of Louisville. We have the 138th Artillery Brigade headquartered out of Lexington that again is responsible for coordinating artillery support to large combat formations. We have the 149th Maneuver Enhancement Brigade headquartered out of Richmond, and that's really where the core of our domestic response capabilities reside. Their subordinate units consist of engineer, military police, chemical battalion, and sustainment, which is logistics and maintenance, things like that. The 123rd Air Wing is our Air National Guard component, headquartered out of Louisville, co-located with Standiford Field. They've got a lot of capabilities mirroring the Army National Guard side. They've got security forces that mirror Army MPs. They have airfield repair and maintenance that mirror the Army engineer capabilities, just on a smaller scale. One advantage that the Air National Guard does have is being smaller. Very often they're more agile and can deploy a little faster. The next unit is 75th Troop Command, also headquartered out of Louisville. So their brigade headquarters, their subordinate units are an infantry and a sustainment battalion. That sustainment battalion has a lot of trucks, so they have a very robust transportation capability in that brigade. And the brigade headquarters can coordinate any type of unit assigned to them for a response. Then we have our Joint Forces Headquarters element stationed at Boone National Guard Center. So across all those units, we have a lot of different capabilities. Infantry, our engineering community has both combat capabilities like route clearance and counter IED elements, as well as construction equipment. Kentucky has a very large artillery presence. We've got Black Hawk and Lakota aviation capabilities. Mission Command is what we refer to as our headquarters elements that provide command and control over subordinate units. Logistics, military police, I'm not going to read the whole slide to you. So we have all these capabilities, but not all are applicable to a domestic response situation. So when I start looking at the tools in my toolbox, my infantry force doesn't do a lot for me. That's a lot of guys, but their combat mission is exactly that. It's combat. So I can't apply a lot of their skills to domestic response. It's a large workforce, so if all I need are people with work gloves to drag brush, I can use those guys. But their skill set doesn't apply. The same thing with some of the combat engineering. We don't do a whole lot of minefield clearance and things like that. It follows with artillery. I have grown up in my career as an artilleryman, and it pains me to say, but cannons don't do a whole lot on the Commonwealth's worst day, responding to ice storms and floods and potentially New Madrid. So the capabilities you see there colored red really don't bring any equipment capability to the domestic response. The ones that I've got yellow dots on are capabilities we can utilize, but in a somewhat limited fashion. So the Kentucky military police structure is really focused on combat. The Army has, by and large, two types of military police: law and order, what we think of as police patrol, making arrests, maintaining order on posts, and we have combat MPs that are responsible for keeping routes open, dealing with enemy prisoners of war, things like that. And that's the type of MPs that Kentucky has, are combat MPs. So even though people see, okay, if you've got an MP unit here, I need assistance with domestic law enforcement, they're not necessarily trained to the same standard that a civilian law enforcement officer is. They're trained on a different skill set. The cyber folks are going to talk to you later. We operate with some restrictions there. There's federal restrictions on how we can connect our federal systems and apply the protections that we have there to state and local systems. We're still working through that, and they'll address some of the structures they're trying to build and authorities they're trying to develop. The same with medical. So we have a lot of medics. Each unit has a combat medic, but they're not certified as EMTs or paramedics. So sometimes we're limited on the amount of care we can provide to civilian personnel, and it doesn't mirror what we can provide to military personnel. Our signal folks, so radios, satellite communications, just because we can establish a military satellite internet communication network in an area doesn't mean that we can plug your local dispatch center or your emergency operations center into it, just because of the security structures in place in military networks. So the gist of this is there's some military capabilities we can't apply to domestic problems, and there's some that we can apply in a limited fashion. Then there at the bottom of the slide are some civil support specific capabilities we have. So the Kentucky National Guard has what we call a SURF-P, a chemical enhanced response force package. So it's structured to provide support in the event of hazmat incidents. They can do decontamination and of personnel and structures. They're trained on doing search of collapsed structures and wide area search. This is the team that went into the candle factory and conducted the wide area searches after the floods. We also have a civil support team that's structured to provide advising and analysis capability specifically to law enforcement. And I'll talk a little bit about what their capabilities are later. All right, and I apologize for the delay. All right, so one way we try to translate our military capability into civil response capability is by developing mission sets and mission-ready packages. So we use those to define an emergency response capability built out of our combat structures. So on the left side of the screen, you see a description of what a self-propelled field artillery unit would provide. So we've got those units in Carlisle, Bardstown, and Carrollton. So I've got 70 people. That's a lot of folks to be able to call in the event of an emergency. But those armored vehicles don't do a lot for me. So if there's a flood, we have a demand for high axle vehicles. So we've developed a high axle team of one high axle vehicle, 2 operators. So out of that unit, I can only field 5 high axle teams because of my equipment limitation at that location. So even if you have an armory in your community, they may not have the equipment that you need. We may have to bring it in from somewhere else. And just because you see, 70 or 80 guys coming to drill, I might not be able to use all of them. Because as you look at that field artillery unit, they're designed to move in those armored vehicles. The high axle vehicles and the Humvees physically don't have enough seats to move 70 personnel. So if I want to deploy that unit in support of a domestic emergency, I've got to find vehicles to move them because the howitzers and the ammo vehicles we have at Fort Knox really don't provide any utility to me in time of emergency. So when we respond to an emergency, we're going to send a liaison officer to your EOC and your local community, and they're going to have a playbook of these teams that we've developed. So here's an example of the high axle team that I mentioned before. They'll be able to articulate to your emergency managers what equipment we have available, what capabilities they have, and how we can field that. So we have a build sheet for each one of those that describes the capabilities. And here's a list of the mission team types that we've developed. Our goal is to define these to units. So when there is an emergency, I can tell units, let me know how many high axle teams you can field. Let me know how many wrecker teams you can field. And that way I'm speaking a common language from our operations center down to the units and to your emergency operations centers. And you can see there the different mission team types we have, what their purpose is. Pretty much all of those units, we're going to define tasks that they can perform when we put them in the field, and also define tasks that they cannot perform without further authorization. Like high axle teams are authorized to evacuate people, to move first responders. They can take essential employees, like, if a nurse is stranded on the other side of a flooded area, we can give them a ride to the hospital so they can work their shift. Things they can't do are transport the media or transport fatalities or insurance adjusters and things like that, just because that's not an immediate response emergency requirement. And I'll leave that slide up for a moment so you can read over those teams. So some of our commonly used capabilities. So the executive order that we operate under for emergencies tells us that we can respond, with any element of the National Guard that is appropriate for the response. Basically, we're not limited to a portion of the National Guard. In a worst case scenario, we could get almost 7,000 of us in the field. But some of the capabilities that we're called on is very often just a rapidly expandable workforce to operate points of distribution, drag brush out of the road, what we call toss teams, because no other element of the state really has a reserve force that they can call on. We have a unique capability of rough terrain and high axle vehicles. So a lot of counties have 2 and 3 ton trucks, but they can't get through a washed out road, whereas our trucks can. That being said, as soon as conditions return to where civilian vehicles can operate in an area, we'd ask that those take over and we let our folks go back home. So currently, the Kentucky National Guard has, I may misquote this, but I believe 6 helicopters that are hoist capable for search and rescue. The Kentucky State Police has 1 hoist-capable helicopter, so the majority of that state resource resides in the Kentucky Guard. We're called on to do roadway clearance, both with equipment and by hand, traffic control, is always a request, and law enforcement augmentation. Again, we say limited because post-civil disturbance, our law enforcement requests are looked at really closely and vetted. And again, we prefer to do infrastructure protection rather than actual law enforcement patrols. And that's just based on the amount of risk we assume once we do active patrolling with law enforcement. If that mission is requested and approved, it would have to be joint patrols, and we'd establish a ratio, whether it's 2 National Guardsmen to 1 law enforcement officer, or 1 to 1, whatever the situation dictates, and depending on the assessment of risk. All right, I mentioned some specialized capabilities we have that are structured for domestic response, and one of them is what we call our SURF-P, the chemical response. Again, they have search and extraction teams, both for wide area and collapsed structure. All the members of our search and extraction team are certified in enclosed space and collapsed structure rescues. They can do decontamination. Our fatality search and rescue team, sadly enough, we had to utilize those both for the tornadoes and the flood, and they're currently deployed to North Carolina. But they can assist local coroners with appropriately dealing with remains, and they come with a mobile mortuary trailer to augment local capabilities. Our civil support team is a much smaller element, but they're focused on supporting law enforcement. Their primary capability is that they have a mobile laboratory that is certified to perform identification of unknown materials. So the only 2 labs in the state, to my knowledge, that are certified are the KSP Central Lab here in Frankfort and our mobile lab. So if law enforcement goes to a scene and there's a substance they believe it to be toxic or explosive or whatever the question is, there's 2 mobile labs or 2 labs in the state that can identify that substance with a court admissible level of certainty, and that's the Central Lab and our mobile lab that the civil support team owns. So other elements of the Kentucky National Guard, we have state partnership program with, we're partnered with Djibouti, the country of Djibouti in East Africa, and the country of Ecuador in South America, but those are also other demands on our time. So we've got our combat mission to train on. We've got obligations to our partners in Djibouti and Ecuador to engage with them. So I went to Ecuador last year and talked to their emergency management personnel based on my full-time assignment in the Kentucky Operations Center. And I had a similar engagement in Djibouti just a couple months ago. And we have 2 to 3 teams in each country every month. So that's further demand on our part-time force, another mission to staff. So some of our authorities and limitations. So when we go into state active duty, we operate under 4 executive orders issued by the governor every year. The primary one you'll see in your counties is emergency response. When there's a flood, when there's an ice storm, when you need help, that's the one we're going to come in under. There's all hazards planning, which we use to assist in developing our long-term plans, both for New Madrid as well as other statewide all hazards response. So Lieutenant Douglas and Specialist Snyder that I'll talk to you later, they're working under that executive order to provide cyber planning to develop structures for how the state is going to support, or how the State National Guard is going to support local communities in cyber incidents. Fairs, festivals, and observances. So our Adjutant General has a line of effort that he tells us every year. He wants us to be involved in communities. And in support of that, the governor issues an executive order that allows us to place people in state active duty to do things like support during the Kentucky Derby, but it's also support during the Blackberry Festival in Carlisle. It's support during Country Ham Days. So if your community has a festival or a fair or an event that you need National Guard support for, there's a slide later on that I'd ask you to take a picture of that explains how to get that support. There's also a counter-drug mission executive order. that we very seldom utilize because that's primarily executed in a federal role. But the governor recognizes the importance of that, and he gives us the ability to support law enforcement for counter drug every year. In the emergency response, the governor exerts his authority under KRS 38030, and the adjutant general can allocate state active duty as needed to support the National Guard internally under KRS 36040. So to dig a little deeper into our emergency response, we are a backup or at best a tertiary response for almost all the ESFs in the state at the order of the governor. So we very seldom get missions direct. We will take the overflow from the ESFs. So if you need roads cleared for incidents and your local organic capabilities aren't enough, we would expect that you'll go to an adjoining county that you have a mutual assistance agreement with. Then you'll go to the state. Transportation Cabinet is ESF 1. If they don't have the capability to provide the resources you need, then it would come to us. But we would be backup for the other ESFs. Unless it's a unique capability that we're the sole owner of, like high axle vehicles, and as I said, we're the primary provider for hoist in the state, for rescues. Those are the only missions that would normally come to us direct. They would be filtered through other ESFs first. To come in an emergency response, there needs to be a declared emergency. It doesn't have to be a state emergency. It can be city or the county judge executive, but we need that declared emergency to trigger our capability to respond to your community under our emergency executive order. Our response time, it just depends on the capability you need and where it's located. If you're in Nicholas County and you just need teams to drag brush out of the road, I can get that artillery unit to get some guys on the road probably in 4 to 6 hours. If you need engineer equipment in central Kentucky, that's got to come from the eastern or the western part of the state, and I'm probably looking at closer to 24 hours to get you the help you need. We're never going to turn you down. I just want to make sure you're aware of, we'll always be there, but we'll very seldom be able to be the first one there. It takes a while to get the wheels turning. All right, so for special events, so we provide color guards, parades, we do salute cannons, we do traffic control to help people stay safe during the Bourbon Festival or during the Apple Festival down in Casey County. So we get a lot of requests to do security. If you have an event downtown and you've got vendors and they're leaving things out overnight, we get a lot of requests to provide security overnight to make sure there's no pilfering, and that's not something we can do unless it's requested from law enforcement as a law enforcement augmentation mission. That's just not a mission that we can execute on our own. We don't have the statutory authorities to limit people's access to somewhere unless we're partnered with a law enforcement organization. We can't take people into custody. There's an allowance in statute that we can be deputized, but it's I couldn't tell you the last time that was exercised just because of the level of risk that local government would be assuming in deputizing our folks due to the difference between DOCJT approved law enforcement training and what my MPs have, the training for their combat role. Additionally, I got an extract out of a Army regulation there that kind of specifically defines the things we can't do. So we can provide traffic control, but we can't do vehicle parking. The field you're parking everybody in the fair, hey, we're happy to come and make sure that traffic's flowing safely, that pedestrians and vehicular traffic are being controlled so that nobody gets hurt, but we can't wave people into specific parking lots as a matter of convenience. It really needs to be tied to community safety for us to come in and give you a hand. So some of our limitations. I mentioned location of equipment is always a challenge. If you need specific equipment, it might not be right next door to where you are. Sometimes finding qualified operators that are available are a challenge. Every winter during ice storms, we get requests for heavy wreckers. So I've got maybe 20 heavy wreckers across the state, but I've only got about 30 operators. So getting the right operator who is available, linked to that piece of equipment in time and space is sometimes a challenge, and that just makes our response time even longer. By and large, the Adjutant General does not want to exert his authority to involuntarily mobilize folks, so we operate with a volunteer force. At any time, we estimate that about 10% of our folks will be available and willing to volunteer. One of the things I like to remind our emergency managers and county judge executives of is that everybody I send to your county is a volunteer, and they've got an entirely different job that they're not doing at that time. So the folks I have directing traffic on your worst day, man, we're super happy to provide them, and we're glad to be of assistance. But that means a history class isn't getting taught at a middle school, tires aren't getting put on a car at the Toyota plant in Georgetown. Somebody's having to cover a shift at a city police department while that National Guard member is out somewhere else. So I have an obligation to try to get those guys back to their civilian jobs and their families as quickly as possible. Also, we can't replace civilian capabilities. If there's a civilian organization that can provide a capability, we're not supposed to compete with them. So if you have a local record service that can provide a capability, it would be inappropriate for me to employ a military wrecker to provide that capability. Now, if the terrain and conditions don't allow them to provide their capability, meaning, when there's ice on the road, very few civilian wreckers are all-wheel drive. Hey, I've got 20 or 30 eight-wheel drive wreckers that I can put on the road. But once conditions allow civilian equipment to be appropriate, under the conditions specified in the executive order, I'm supposed to hand that over to civilian organizations. If you've got long-term needs, there is a program called the Innovative Readiness Training Program. With sufficient planning, we can provide things like engineering capability. So if a community wants to build a park or needs some earth moving done for a construction project, if we can tie that into training that our units need to do, that's something we can do, but you're looking at 12 to 18 months planning ahead of time for that to be evaluated and approved for us to do. That's not something you can call and need, earth moved 6 weeks, 6 months from now on that we'll be able to do. That has to be approved at the national level. And I mentioned before, any law enforcement augmentation is vetted very closely. We've got to be partnered with civilian law enforcement, and I've got combat MPs, not law enforcement MPs. So the past couple of years, we've really tried to get out into communities and conduct more outreach. So cities and counties are more aware of what the National Guard can do and can't do and how to request our capabilities. So every county should have had a team at least once over the past 18 months come and meet with your emergency manager, county judge executive, and ideally sheriff and other elected officials to explain what our capabilities are, how to request us, and to get an idea for what your worst day looks like in your county and what your gaps in your response plan might be, requirements that we might need to fill. We also try to get an idea of what the hazards are in your county, what major roads are, and things like that. If you're not aware of that, talk to your county emergency manager and judge executive, and they should be able to get you scheduled for the next time we come to visit. So our current plan is on odd years, we do county visits. On even years, we update our plans and do exercises. So in 2024, we've updated our all hazards plan. In 2025, we're going to start scheduling county visits again. So if you'd like to be part of that, work through your emergency manager. They'll reach out to our team and schedule a date for you. So in the past, the Kentucky National Guard has really been focused on the response phase of emergency management, with the acknowledgement that during the response phase, we're going to set conditions for long-term recovery. So in the military, we try to plan for the most dangerous thing to happen and the most likely thing to happen. In Kentucky, the most dangerous thing to happen is a New Madrid seismic event. And that's where the lion's share of our planning has been applied in the past. However, we've recognized that the most likely event is a local emergency where we respond to a 1 to 4 county event like flooding or severe ice storms. And we're starting to apply more planning power to planning for those events. And that's what we're getting into individual counties and meeting with you all. And we're trying to balance that planning emphasis to make sure that we're getting the right resources programmed and have the right plans in place to provide to you all. Let's see. So we conducted a communications exercise this year based on a New Madrid scenario. We're participating in an exercise with Tennessee National Guard next year that's also focused on a New Madrid response. And we do monthly seminars and a tabletop exercise with the Kentucky Emergency Management, again, with a focus on planning for local emergency responses. All right, now we'll go into how to request our assistance. So emergency requests should be in, we can go into immediate response authority in protection of life, limb, eyesight. That means if a unit is drilling, if a unit's at annual training, regardless of their status, if there's an immediate emergency, we can respond. The appropriate status to be in is state active duty, but if it's a true emergency, we can use our folks regardless of what status they're in. To place people into emergency response, whether it's immediate response or in state active duty, those resource requests should come through WebEOC. Your city and county emergency managers should all have access to WebEOC. If you need something and you don't know what ESF is applicable, route it to ESF 5 and they'll allocate it. Again, 95% of the requests we get should already have been filtered through another ESF, and we take their overflow, when their resources are completely tapped. When you put requests in, we would ask that you don't ask for 10 soldiers and 5 trucks. Tell us what you need accomplished, like, hey, I need 5 miles of roadway cleared of downed trees, or I need traffic control at these 3 locations on this roadway for 24 hours. And we'll figure out the best way that we can execute that for you. It may be that we can just park some equipment and block a roadway, or it may be that we need soldiers and a truck there at that intersection. But again, try to make your request based on the capability you need and the problem you need solved, and we'll make sure to apply the solution to it. There on the right is kind of the echelonment of requests, city, county, mutual assistance, city to city or county to county, filtered through the state and ESFs. The Kentucky National Guard will get that overflow. If we don't have the capability, we'll enact or activate emergency assistance compacts, EMACs, throughout FEMA Region 4 and other regions. So during the floods, we activated EMACs with West Virginia and Tennessee for additional hoist aircraft. And then we can reach outside of Region 4 and go nationwide. So currently, we're providing personnel to Florida and North Carolina. Florida has people coming from as far away as Nebraska. They'll be passing through Kentucky in the next 24 hours. We're going to give them a place to overnight, and then they're going to continue on to Florida to assist with their recovery. So the National Guard is a nationwide response capability. We can reach out to other states on Kentucky's worst day. We have a plan in place for New Madrid. We know what help we're getting from who, and we're refining that plan this year, and we'll exercise that plan next year with Tennessee. So to request support for events like fairs, festivals, parades, that has to go through the Kentucky National Guard Public Affairs Office. They do an ethical and legal review. So the Army Regulation Extract I showed you before says the things we can't do, so our public affairs officer makes sure that we're not getting in trouble with regulation or ethics. We can't do things like provide a static display vehicle for a touch-a-truck if somebody's profiting off that. So if your local library's having a touch-a-truck day, man, we're happy to bring Humvees or big trucks or whatever we have to you. But if a private organization is doing a touch-a-truck day that they're selling tickets for, that's not something we can support with publicly owned equipment. So there's two forms for ground equipment. The request is a DD 2536. If you want aircraft, it's a DD 2535. We request a minimum of 30 days notice because that lets our units have one drill, approximately every 30 days before the event to find volunteers. So take a picture of this screen. There's the email address, and the web page there has those forms and instructions on how to request that support. Again, we support around 120 fairs and festivals every year. We like to get out into communities. Selfishly, that gives us more visibility for recruiting, but it also lets communities know that we're there and just, we like to be visible. Even if it's a elementary school event where we're not recruiting anybody, our Agent General recognizes the importance of us having close links with our communities, and we're going to support that as fully as we possibly can. So before I go into closing thoughts, I'm going to bring up Lieutenant Douglas, who's going to talk about Kentucky's development of a new cyber capability. So I'll pass it off to him.
Thank you. So I'm Lieutenant Jaden Douglas with the Kentucky Army National Guard, specifically in the cyber program, and we are developing the Cyber Resilience Initiative. So as we rely more on our networks and all of our devices that help us day to day, it becomes a little bit of a paradox of protection as we try to balance our cybersecurity needs with our overall usability. Unfortunately, the vulnerabilities that can come from this are being exploited by cyber criminals globally and at an exponential rate each year. So in response to that, as I mentioned before, myself, Specialist Snyder, are working on state active duty orders to develop the Kentucky Cyber Resilience Initiative, which has the mission of building trust, cyber resiliency, and shared capabilities across both public and private sectors. And one of the ways we do this is through the Emergency Support Function 17. Mr. Stafford mentioned some of those other emergency support functions. This one is centered on the cyber realm. It provides a centralized entity for responding to cyber incidents that affect the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And the lead agency for this currently is the Office of Homeland Security. And we work with them with training exercises and attend a lot of their meetings as well. This is a collaborative effort. But specifically, the Kentucky Army National Guard has a defense operations team. We have that one located up here in Frankfort, and then we also have our cyber unit in Louisville that drills on the weekends, but they can be put on state active duty orders to respond to cyber. They have the capability to be put on orders to respond to cyber incidents. However, like you mentioned, we are developing this concept where the authorities would lie. But we can respond to train, advise, and assist requests, and through the same means, you can reach out to our Domestic Operations Center and then request us. Along with that, to hit on a little bit of our signal capabilities as well, we have a robust wireless communication stop, which includes HF radios, satellite communications, and a lot of other things that can help provide communications during the event of a emergency. And another thing to think about is the National Guard. I think you said 6,500 members currently, roughly. A lot of those where they might be an infantryman on their drill side. Well, they might work for a IT firm or Microsoft or Google or something like that on their full-time support. On their full-time job. So we have a wealth of knowledge across the National Guard. One of the benefits of having that dual status. And one final thing I'm going to hit on is, as I mentioned before, we are working in conjunction with the Office of Homeland Security to do several tabletop exercises and things of that nature. We are also working with Murray State University and University of Louisville next fall to put on a collaborative FEMA Region 4 exercise. And if you have members of your IT departments or anyone from your local government that would like to participate, feel free to reach out. This is still in the early stages of development, but we are looking to have that exercise be available for local and state government agencies and governments as well. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. All right, so a few closing thoughts, and then I'll open it up to questions. So one of the things we found in doing county visits last year, especially when we went into some of the flood counties, when we asked about mutual assistance, the county would say, well, hey, we call the next county, but they were underwater too. So something we would encourage is if you're building mutual assistance plans, you really need to communicate what you expect your worst day to be and what you expect your partner's worst day to be. And if they're the same thing, you don't really have a mutual assistance plan in place. So this slide has FEMA Region 4. You see there in the lower right. Kentucky is the northern and westernmost state in FEMA Region 4. Our worst day is New Madrid, as is Tennessee's. However, Kentucky and Tennessee, if New Madrid happens, have the luxury that will not affect North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Florida. So we know on our worst day we can pull support from them. Conversely, Florida is currently experiencing their worst day, as is North Carolina, post-hurricane. That has minimal effect on us here in Kentucky and in Tennessee. So we know that we've still got both our feet under us and we can pour support into them. So again, compare what the worst day is with your partners and make sure that you've really got a workable plan. Our guidance as we've gone through counties is, hey, you can look at a topographic map. If your worst day is a flood, see who else is in the drainage of your primary river, and none of them are going to be able to help you on your worst day. You've got to get, across the next ridge to the next river before they're going to be able to help you. So conversations we've had to have, especially during the floods, again, it takes us a while to get there, and especially during the floods, one of our engineer units lost the majority of their equipment in Jackson. So the equipment we would use to respond to floods and help mitigate the damage in those communities was itself affected by the flood. So we had further constraints on the equipment available. So as counties were making requests, personally, I really like this, the picture there on the right. So in each county, they were experiencing their absolute worst day ever, and I don't question that at all. I know for a fact it was the worst day in a lot of our counties. However, we've got to be able to step back at the state level and decide, well, where is it worse between the two? I acknowledge this is your worst day, but it's worse in the county next to you, and that's where I've got to send my equipment initially. That has implications for New Madrid. So in Kentucky, we're well aware as we build our New Madrid plan that we are not going to be the focus of federal assets for the first probably 72 hours. Federal assets are going to pour into Memphis and St. Louis because those are huge population centers that will be possibly drastically affected by a New Madrid event. So Kentucky, we're going to have to rely on our other state partners, probably outside of FEMA Region 4, and other National Guards and bordering states to kind of prop us up until more federal assets are available to be applied to our problems. So here's contact information. There's the main line. 6800 rings multiple phones in our office. If you have any specific questions, there's my email address and my direct line. So Major Jason Spade is our branch chief. He is heading up our engagement with Tennessee for their New Madrid exercise next year, and also spearheading our planning updates. He is currently in Florida in their Joint Operations Center, helping get our plan off the ground to support Florida post landfall as they recover. So if you email him, it might be a few days, but if you have any questions that you think of later, feel free to email me, and I will open it up to questions for myself or Lieutenant Douglas.
Brian, I do want to acknowledge a comment in here. Bobby Russell, thank you for your service. Proud member of 1st of the 623rd, 22 years in that artillery unit. So we got to, but just you and me, Brian, there's a third artilleryman in the room, which 3 artillery guys usually means trouble. So, but any questions, any closing thoughts from anybody out there? Again, just want to acknowledge that, you know, the National Guard does play a very important role in our disaster response planning. And again, you know, we're all very appreciative of the role that they play in the services that they provide. But I do want to go back and reemphasize what Brian said. They're never going to be your first response. It's going to take them a while to get there. And I know sometimes a lot of people, this rubs them the wrong way, but as soon as they get there, they're already trying to figure out when they can end their mission, because they're taking people away from their families and their full-time jobs to, you know, to respond. So they have that, they have the responsibility to get those people back into their full-time, real world jobs and that kind of stuff. And the other thing I think that we have to think of from a county perspective is they're probably the most expensive response piece going out there, which maybe doesn't necessarily apply to us because we're not paying for them out of our county budgets or whatever, but the state or somebody's paying for them to come respond to your county. So, you know, that money doesn't just flow continuously. So, you know, at some point they have to disengage and go back to, you know, turn that response over to local communities. So, but again, the capabilities that they can provide are in some cases, capabilities only they can provide. So they're a very important piece of what we do in emergency management. And Brian, thank you for coming and being part and explaining all of this, you know, to our folks who are here today. Again, last chance, anybody for questions? Any closing thoughts, Brian?
Well, I see somebody has a hand up.
Yeah, sure.
I do. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we
Yes,
got
ma'am.
you.
Okay. I wanted to ask a question. When it's an emergency, y'all only communicate with our judge executive and our EMS person, or can the magistrates request you all as well?
So it needs to come through emergency management. So WebEOC is the system of record that provides visibility from the county through the state level for requests, and it helps deconflict requests, because what we found during the floods is a city emergency manager and a county emergency manager both might have access to that system, and they would put the same request in, and having that visibility to see, okay, we've got 2 requests for the exact same thing in this county. Let's make a phone call or 2 and make sure that we're not overcommitting resources. So if a magistrate who should have a good idea of what their district needs can partner with the emergency manager to get those requests in and make sure that location's right and that the problem's defined and we can apply the right resources. Now, to kind of elaborate on what Mr. Kovach said, so yeah, one of our focuses is completing our response and getting our folks home, but we're not going to leave you high and dry. We're not going to say, hey, it's been 3 days, we're leaving. So if we have more than 1 or 2 teams in a county, we're going to assign a liaison officer to your emergency operations center. So there's going to be a senior NCO or a junior officer that comes in there and works with your emergency manager and helps find solutions. So we acknowledge if your emergency operations center is stood up, your emergency manager is going to be overwhelmed. It's very likely the worst day in that county. So we're going to provide somebody to make phone calls, to provide a vehicle. We've taken emergency managers in Humvees, up hollers that they couldn't get up otherwise. We're going to provide that direct support capability to your emergency operations center. And part of what that L&O will do is help develop that disengagement and replacement plan. If he needs to make some calls and chase down like, hey, does the state have a contract in place for this? Is the transportation cabinet ready to take over this mission? And assist us with the mission transition to civilian authorities.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome, ma'am.
Anyone else? Again, Brian, Jaden, thank you guys. Everyone who's here, thank you very much. And I believe that then concludes our training. Have a great day.
All right, thank you all for the opportunity.